Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 100 of Humanity Rising. Since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations from all over the world have come together to create a common ground, a sacred space. Each day between 5 and 6:30 p.m. Central European Time on Zoom, so that people worldwide can come together and share their experiences of how they're navigating through this extraordinary pandemic, an unprecedented event in all of human history that has put essentially the entire world in lockdown and a new social need, social distancing, and an acute awareness of our health and the very problematic nature of the human future. The mission of Humanity Rising is to provide not only a place where we can just come together to share, but also a place where we can come together to imagine a new world, share solutions, and probably most fundamentally, how can we come together at this critical moment when scientists are telling us that we're running out of time? How can we come together to ensure that the world is more sustainable, resilient, healthy, abundant, and in alignment with natural systems as we move inexorably into the future and beyond the pandemic? The pandemic is proving itself to be very intractable. 6 months in, our economies are at virtual standstills. We're still under lockdown. COVID rates are now going up almost everywhere around the world. This weekend, the United States will pass 200,000 dead in the face of probably the most incompetent governmental response in the world about COVID. The United States is 4% of the human population, and we have 23% of all the cases and all the deaths. And in the midst of it all, climate change ravages the West Coast. Fires are burning across Siberia. There's flooding in Asia, as extreme weather events now combine with the spread of infectious diseases to produce a world that's even more fragile than when we started the pandemic. So where we go at this moment to try to sort things out, not only to make sense of what's happening, but to figure out a cogent way through, is not an inconsequential conversation. And that is why Humanity Rising is here, so that we can convene these conversations that matter and try as best we can to turn them into actions that make a difference. So today we're going to examine the rise of the Green Swan. The term Black Swan has been with us since nearly the beginning of Western civilization. It was a term first used by Juvenal, the Russian poet in the 2nd century CE, referring to one of his poems being as rare as a black swan. And then over time, it began to get currency, particularly when people thought that the only swans in the world were white swans. Then about 150 years ago, they found black swans in Australia. And then it was Nicholas Taleb, if you read his great book about 15 years ago on black swan events. He really popularized this notion of an event that seems impossible, certainly rare. And when it pops up, it takes everybody by surprise. And it's only in hindsight that people say, oh, yeah, that was completely predictable, given what we now know. And so the term Black Swan events around the market crash of 2008, 9/11 was considered a Black Swan event. The election of Donald Trump was a Black Swan event. But what we're going to be discussing today is the rise of the Green Swans. Environmental initiatives through companies that are experiencing an exponential impact, the common good. So that's our subject today on day 100, the rise of the Green Swan. But before I introduce our panel, I would like to just pause, as we do every day when we start, to engage in 1 minute of heart coherence. Probably the most important thing any of us can be doing right now in a time of complete and escalating chaos is to create coherence. What Prigogine called islands of coherence in a sea of chaos. We can form coherence through all manner of means, at a community level, at a family level. And what we've been exploring over the months now in Humanity Rising is just simple heart coherence. So for the next minute, just close your eyes and either put your hand on your heart or just become aware of your heart. Try to listen for your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive and that there are other hearts beating with you at this time. 1 minute. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart, I welcome my good friend, John Montgomery, a very prominent lawyer and investor in Silicon Valley whose career has coincided with the last 30, 40 years of Silicon Valley development, one of the epicenters of creativity on planet Earth. So, John, it's a pleasure to have you convene your second panel with Humanity Rising on the rising of the Green Swan. John?
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to report that we've got the two preconditions for systems change in the global economic system. First, there's a general acknowledgement that capitalism as we know it is broken. Second, we have a viable alternative. Today, we're going to hear from the leaders of 5 green swans in that viable alternative. John Elkington will explain green swans a little bit more in a moment. As you listen to these stories, notice how courageously these leaders lean into our disruptive future. These times demand courageous, forward-thinking leaders like these, not the false promises of autocrats and demagogues. As I turn it over to John Elkington now, may the stories of these 5 green swans give you hope, inspiration, and courage to lean with us into that disruptive future. Thank you.
John, thank you very much indeed. So this is John Elkington. I'm now going to go through this slightly heart-stopping moment of trying to find the slides and pop them up onto the screen, but that will take me just a moment. Here we are. And Jim, just a personal comment. I mean, day 100, how extraordinary. Well done. Both for your commitment and for the power of what you're doing. And it's a remarkable panel that we've managed to pull together. Now, I'm going to talk about the Green Swan, as I'm instructed to do so, and then I'm going to hand over to the first of our panelists. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm 71 years old. I've been over 40 years in the environmental and then sustainability space. Have co-founded 4 social businesses since 1978. To my considerable surprise, they still all exist. Visiting professor at 3 universities. I've been on over 70 boards and advisory boards and have just published the 20th book, which is the theme today. And clearly all of this is happening right smack bang in the middle of the pandemic already. Touched upon. And I actually think in many ways, although that's a complete horror, it's extremely exciting as well, because it's destabilizing a system that is not working for many of us and certainly will not work for future generations. And so that's an opportunity for us to respond. The problems that we face are increasingly going exponential, whether we like it or not, whether we call them black swans, whether we call them wicked or super wicked problems. And this diagram, many of you will have seen, but I just think it's a useful reminder of the character of what we now collectively face. And COVID-19 itself is very clearly linked to a range of environmental and social, and to some degree governance challenges that we're failing to get on top of effectively. And the likelihood is, this diagram comes from the World Wildlife Fund, the likelihood is as we press deeper and deeper into Amazonia, into other relatively virgin environments, we're going to have more and more of these pandemic issues. So some people who are listening today or watching today may remember that earlier in the 1990s, I came up with the cartoon on the bottom left. And I got the Financial Times cartoonist Ingram Pin, still a very successful cartoonist with the FT, to do this cartoon for me. And it basically shows a boardroom with the fish on the left, representing the natural world and its potential voice in the boardroom. The woman representing the dispossessed, the poor, and on the right hand was the robot, and that was simply a joke in a way at the time, talking about or symbolizing a long-term future. It's not a joke any longer. Some of you all know that in 2014, the first expert system was appointed to a board in Hong Kong.
Excuse me, John.
Yes.
Your screen share doesn't seem to be appearing.
Oh, let me just go back again and try again. Apologies to everyone. I did the screen share thing first. The only other thing I can think of is I actually sent see, there's the share.
If you share your screen, your desktop will appear and you need to just click on whatever one you want to show. There we go.
Is that now coming up?
It's coming up, but it's coming up with our Ubiverse description of the session today, not your slide.
How very strange. Try this again.
Because we're seeing your desktop. So there we go. There we go. Now we've got it.
Jeremy, well, sorry. Next time, let me know a little earlier. But I apologize to everyone. Can always share the slide deck separately. So the diagram on the left, I was just saying, is a cartoon done in 1991 by Ingram Pin of the Financial Times, and it shows the natural world, the social agenda in a way, and the deep future, and the way in which they needed to engage with boardrooms. Then 2 years ago, having used that cartoon as the launch platform for the notion of the triple bottom line, I did a product recall, which the Harvard Business Review told me was the first time that had ever been done. And that sets the context for what I'm about to say. And this is a diagram put together by the Future Fit Foundation. And what it shows is a series of stages in which the corporate agenda has evolved from a world in which, and Milton Friedman's article, the 50th anniversary in the New York Times, has just been marked, if not necessarily celebrated, a world in which environment and society were very much outside the world of business. Then with concepts like the triple bottom line, shared value, and so on, they started to overlap. And now we're moving into a world where it's very clear that we're going to have to think about this in a very different way with nested systems. The B Corporation world, which Shami and Love will talk about in a moment, is immensely exciting. I think it's a wonderful movement. I think it's having a very impressive impact on the way in which businesses think, at least leadership businesses. And Guilherme Leal of Natura has been a pioneer in that area for a very long time. This front cover of the Financial Times appeared a couple of years back, and it was very striking, beginning of last year. And it was just one of those moments where you suddenly realize things are changing, even in the mainstream. And I mentioned Milton Friedman. Some of you will see, many of you will hopefully have seen the advertisement that people around the B Corporation world and similar movements took in the New York Times, just to mark 50 years of Friedman and basically say, thank you, but no thanks. He was a brilliant man, had a very impressive impact, but in many ways has been misinterpreted, and it's taken us into some very counterproductive directions. So just to set up the Green Swan argument, on the right, you have three themes: responsibility, resilience, regeneration. I'm not going to read through all the bullet points, just simply to make the point that for about 30 or 40 years now, the corporate responsibility movement has focused on how can companies be more responsible, more accountable, more transparent, all of that good stuff. Unfortunately, that hasn't really changed the systemic crises that we're facing. And what we're now hearing from leaders of all sorts, political leaders, corporate leaders, and so on, is the resilience word, that we've got very major problems with globalization, which has driven efficiency measures way ahead of resilience. But unfortunately, the only way you can really guarantee longer term resilience across the economic, social, environmental, and political systems that we're talking about is to regenerate them. you've got to invest in the regeneration of those systems. Now, at the moment, we've got a growing number of black swans. And in the book, I look at a range of different wicked and super wicked problems that go from plastics in the ocean to antibiotic resistance to overnutrition, as it's sometimes called, but chronic diseases and diabetes, obesity being another term, and things like the climate emergency, which are pressing in increasingly hard. Now, the question is, as Jim has already referenced, can we move from the black swans that take us exponentially where we don't want to go to green swans that take us exponentially where we do need to go or want to go? At the bottom there, you just have a range of the different corporate roles that have been engaged in this discussion. And increasingly, this has not only shot up to the level of the C-suite and boardrooms, but you've got a new breed of people, chief economists, with a much broader perspective on much of this. And I think we're hearing very interesting voices coming into this discussion. So the Nassim Nicholas Taleb has been mentioned. His idea of the Black Swan came out in 2007, just before the financial crash. Indeed, as Jim said, these are outliers, they're complete surprises. They have an off-the-scale impact. And they are rationalized in hindsight. But one of the things that we were told in the book was that very often we misunderstand what's just happened to us, and we therefore set ourselves up for further crises. The Green Swan is where I'm headed next. So I'm not going to read out the definition. I'm just simply going to say that these are not typically, Green Swans are not typically individual companies, nor are they individuals, although we've even had people putting Green Swan messaging on their business cards already. To me, they're market trajectories. They're shifts in our societies and our economies. And when I'm asked to give an example, it's not a perfect example, but I would give the example of the European Union's green recovery plan, 1.82 trillion euros invested, not just to sort of drag ourselves out of the economic hole, but to build in social inclusion and to build in sustainability and climate action. That, for me, things don't have to be at quite that scale, but that, for me, is the sort of level of ambition I think we're now talking about. And luckily, quite a number of technologies are going in an appropriate direction. We've recently set up a Green Swans observatory to try and identify and analyze and support where we can initiatives and projects that are moving in the right direction. And if you look at the solar and wind area, the extraordinary fall in the costs of renewable energy in the last couple of decades has been extremely dramatic. But these trend lines suggest that those are going to continue and in some ways possibly even accelerate. And that will change our reality to a very considerable degree. But all of these new shifts in markets and in our technology and so on will inevitably have unintended consequences. Some of those will be positive, some of those will be negative. And if we think about, for example, wind power, we're only now discovering, as we're trying to get rid of some of these vanes or propellers from the windmills, that they're not recyclable. And no one really thought about how that might be done. Same true, of course, with solar energy. And just towards a conclusion, we've been working inside a number of companies to try and help them get abreast of these sort of exponential trajectories. And one of those, based in Spain, Acciona, is a sort of renewable energy and infrastructure company. And this is a global company. And we've been working with around 30 of their younger fast track leaders to bring them up, not just to speed with the sustainable development goals and so on, because many people still see those as incremental change goals, but to try and think about how we address some of these challenges and opportunities in an exponential way. So this is the last slide. And it's something we've put together with a series of companies that we work with and with a regulatory agency, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. And it's simply to make the point that an old order is actually coming apart all around us. And it's to some degree been informed by a responsibility perspective. As it comes apart, we're going to see more and more crises which threaten our sense of resilience and security and so on. And therefore, I think in the longer term, and a number of the speakers, panelists will address this, we need to embrace the regeneration agenda. Now, that may seem a little abstract to some people, but some of you will also have heard yesterday the CEO of Walmart commit that company to become a regenerative company. Now, that is huge. I mean, we'll see whether they manage to do that. But in terms of this agenda, I think that is an extraordinary development. So I'm going to stop there. And what I'm going to do is hand over to Charmian Love, because I think the B Corporation movement around the world has been an extraordinary example of a green swan emerging. And Charmian, as many of you will know, is chair and co-founder of B Lab UK. So Charmian, if I could hand over to you, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's so nice to be with everybody here today. Where do I want to start, actually? John, I just reflecting on some of the things that you've said, I'm reminded actually of a conversation that I feel like you and I had with the late, great Pamela Hartigan very early on in the Volans journey. And I think she was talking about social entrepreneurs and comparing them to ducks. And she was saying, the thing with social entrepreneurs and ducks is they look really calm while they're gliding across the surface of the water, but you know they're paddling like crazy underneath. And I guess hearing you talk about swans, I was just thinking the swans and the ducks, and actually recognizing that these trajectories these swans are on, you know, swans are beautiful and they're graceful. And I think we can kind of have this visual image of them gliding, but realizing that there is a lot of frantic work that's happening under the surface, and that we should be aware of that in the green swans and the black swans and all the swan space. Yeah, as John knows, actually, I studied art history and classics when I was back in university. And because of that, I often think about the world in images. And ironically, I don't actually have slides today. I was going to sort of just riff and reflect a little bit on some of the things that are being said. But one of the images that's come very much into my mind in thinking about the green swans and in thinking about systems change and what we're talking about here today is Jackson Pollock. Now, some of you who may not have had an art background may be struggling to think about what a Pollock painting is. And let me just describe it for you. I mean, these are massive, massive canvases where what Jackson Pollock as an artist did is he would take cans of paint and he would use brushes and sticks. And he would essentially splatter paint. And so what you would get are these immense, immense paintings that are just full of this like kinetic, quite chaotic energy. And when I think about the world out there right now, that's what my mind goes to. It goes to an image of a Jackson Pollock painting because it is all these different lines interconnected, all these relationships, all these interdependencies. But actually in some of the teaching that I do, I always like to ask students and young people what they see in a Jackson Pollock painting. And it's incredible, the spectrum of things that people can tune into when they look at one of these paintings. Some people see a map of a city. Some people see like the London transportation system because it's all these lines connecting to one another. John, to one of the earlier points that was made, John Montgomery, I know when you were planning for this event, you were sort of saying, you know, we should like, it's jazz and how do we musically go with the flow? And actually that's another thing that Jackson Pollock paintings have been described as, is like frozen jazz. But one of the most powerful answers I had to the question of like, what do you see in this Jackson Pollock painting was actually from a social worker from Hong Kong. And he looked at the image of the Jackson Pollock painting I'd put on a slide, and he paused and he said, what I see is I'm lying underneath a tree and I am gazing up and seeing the sunshine shining through the branches. And I bring that into this space because I think we are recognizing that there is immense complexity and there's chaoticness and there's so much stuff happening all around us and it can be very overwhelming. But the entrance that we all had this today, and just those moments of pause to think about the perspectives that we want to bring to the challenges and how we want to approach it, I think is really important. And I really remember that social worker in his remarks, because that perspective of actually calmly thinking through what that image represented to him, and also finding inspiration in nature. I think there is some magic that we can all be channeling when it comes to addressing the complexity. And in the spirit of nature and perspective, I also wanted to share a word with you all. And it's a word that I learned a couple of years ago, and it has just really fueled me personally in the work that I'm really interested in when it comes to change. And that word is heliotropy. Now, some of you are going to be botanists, or some of you might know Greek language, and so you will intuitively get what heliotropy is. But let me just take a quick moment, because for those of you who haven't heard that word before, like I hadn't, what it represents is actually the word helio, sun, and the Greek verb to turn towards, trepin, tropy. And heliotropy is used in botany to describe the tendency of plants to grow in the direction of the sun. And I'm really inspired by that, because actually what I can imagine and I can see is like a field of sunflowers. And that as the sun crosses across the horizon, the flowers of the sunflowers follow it across the sky. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think we as humans, we are not that different than our cousins in the flora community. I actually really and truly believe that we will grow stronger and taller and faster when we are motivated by things that are full of warmth and light and positivity. That is a motivating force. Now, let's be clear. What we don't want to be is like ostriches putting our heads in the sand. And I don't think I can make that stretch to swans, because I don't think swans even metaphorically put their heads in the sand. But what we can't do is just assume everything's to be okay and focus just on the positives. And I think, John, this is something that comes out really strongly in your book when you talk about the black swans. We have to know and appreciate the black swans are out there. And so what we must lean into is this ability to be hopeful and optimistic and be fueled by possibility, while being anchored in the reality and the urgency of the change that is needed, right? So it's about growing towards the sun and remembering that as sunflowers, we are all rooted into the soil. Now, this idea of both and is really important. And this is like what I want to really use to kind of bridge into a conversation about B Corps. Because I think it was a TED Talk that one of the founders of B Corp, B Lab, J. Cohen Gilbert did back in 2010. He did a great TED Talk. Check it out. It's an old goldie but goodie. But he talked about how one of the things we recognize is the shift in systems need to be like learning how to walk and chew gum at the same time. Actually, it's not learning about it. We know how to do it inherently. I challenge everyone on this line to give that a try, because we as humans have that ability to do two things simultaneously, to walk and chew gum, to be hopeful while grounded in the urgency. And the reason why this is so important is as we talk about B Corps is because that's what B Corps are all about. For those of you who aren't familiar with the B Corp movement, let me just be brief and describe what a B Corp is, because I know we'll be hearing for some other speakers later on that will tell a little bit more of the stories of B Corps in action. The B Corps are for-profit businesses that are certified by B Lab because they have met the highest standard in terms of how they perform, so what their operations are, and what they're in the business of doing, or what their impact business model is. To become a B Corp, you also have to go through a really important step, which is to change your constitution as a business, so your governing documents. So in states or regions where there is benefit corporation legislation, you must be a benefit corporation. In areas where there isn't, you must change your articles to make it absolutely explicit that your director's duties are to equally consider shareholders and stakeholders. So this is both and in action, both recognizing that business can be a force for good, and it can create benefits for both planet and people and shareholders. So we've got this both and in action. Now, the good news is there's 3,500 B Corps in the world and growing. And actually what I can speak to for in the UK is that we have seen in the last year, year-on-year growth. I mean, we have daily users that have doubled since the pandemic broke out compared to last year, as well as a weekly doubling of those who are submitting to go through the B Corp process. So we're seeing real energy and more people wanting to join us in this movement. Now, why this is important is because this is evidence that it is possible in business to really embrace this both and. Now, I also appreciate what I'm talking about are individual businesses, but I don't think individual businesses alone are going to solve the problems of the world as individuals. what is really powerful about the B Corp movement is the community, the collective of B Corps that are coming together. And I think that's where we can see real opportunity for systems change. So it's again, a both and. Both working at your individual business level and making sure you're embracing and continually improving on becoming a B Corp and the things that you need to be a B Corp, while also finding ways to work at the systems level and in a collective. Now, where that's showing up, just really briefly, we've got an incredibly vibrant climate collective where we've had over 700 businesses across our B Corp movement commit to net zero by 2030. We also have a bold ambition in the B Corp movement where we want to actually have 50% of our businesses in this movement committing to net zero by 2030 by the time we get to COP26. So it's going to be bold ambition, but we think this is an important leadership moment. We also know that businesses are going to have to share with each other to meet those big ambitions. And we've already got working groups on circular economy and regenerative toolkits. So this is, again, about coming together. We also have bold ambition here in the UK called Operation Upgrade, where what we want to do is we want to go after Section 172 of the Company Act. And what we want to propose is that there be a mandatory for all businesses in the UK to be what it means to be a B Corp from a legal perspective. So again, making it explicit, those director duties are equally to consider shareholders and stakeholders. Another example of collaboration in action is actually Imperative 21, where I think some people in the chat were even mentioning some of the stuff they saw this past week with NASDAQ, with the article, with the piece in the New York Times. Like, we are recognizing that B Lab alone can't do this. So we are part of this Imperative 21 network, where this is about a movement of movements, a range of organizations coming together to really look at ways in which we can drive systemic change. And that's by working with artists. It's about co-creating a series of imperatives, building that coherence of what is the system we all want to see. So again, this movement of movements, and John, you know, I was reflecting on this idea of the Green Swan. I actually looked this up, realized that a herd or a group of green swans is called a bevy. And I just feel like we need like this bevy of green swans as trajectories that we can all be working on as a collective. You once talked about a blizzard of razor blades to address the Gordian knot. And again, I think this bevy of green swans is another way to frame it that is positive and hopeful. I want to end just really briefly with a comment on the obstacles and accelerants that are out there. I mean, I've already talked about this mindset shift to both and, which I think is really, really important. I'm really inspired by Sir David Attenborough, and when he said that when it comes to climate change, we cannot be radical enough. And I think this idea of making sure that in everything we do, we are thinking about this exponential trajectory. We are challenging and asking ourselves the question, are we being radical enough? Now, I personally think that there's a lot of things we can do to keep on challenging that. We can be building intergenerational teams. We can be mobilizing the arts and the culture communities to really help us stretch our thinking and imagine what could be different. Nigel Topping, who many of you may know is the high-level champion for the COP26 meetings, was in a meeting with him, and he had this powerful line. He said, "We must be guided by the science and inspired and moved by the poetry." Another both and, right? Science and poetry. And with that, I wanted to just sort of land that with you all and say, just find those ways to recognize the science. Be challenged to always ask, are we being radical enough? And be moved by the poetry. And with that, I wanted to leave you actually with some words of poetry that have been moving me. And it picks up on some of the introductory remarks about courage. And the lines of the poem go, "Two things stand like stone, kindness in another's trouble, and courage in your own." So I encourage everyone to think about those stones of kindness and courage on our journey as a Green Swan bevy. Thank you.
Thank you hugely. And for anyone who's not watching the chat channel, I recommend you do. There's a lot of very useful content coming through there. Now, I mentioned in my slightly abortive presentation earlier on the crisis of capitalism. Clearly, there's also a crisis of democracy, and sustainability in a way is a bridge between those two. And somebody who's straddled that divide in a way for a very long time is Guilherme Leal, co-founder of Natura, a huge Brazilian company, the first multinational B Corporation. He's vice chair of the UN Global Compact and has been involved in a huge number of other business-to-business platforms in the space, the BT and the International Chamber of Commerce and so on. So Guilherme, thanks very much for joining us today. And by God, I wish you were running again for president in Brazil, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Good morning, good day for everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here in this conversation. I thank you for the invitation to be part of this beautiful community that you are one of the leaders, the founders, as author, chairman, and chair, and many of you. It's really a great honor and pleasure. I feel at home because I am 70, almost 71 like you, John. And we have been involved in these challenges and how to face this challenge of building a better world since the 90s, the beginning of the 90s. So we have a lot of stories together and movements together. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm not sure if we are really a green swan in the sense of the. It's not our style to say that we will be disruptive. We try to do day after day. We try to promote change, systemic change, but we don't know. The future is open. But anyhow, it would be a pleasure to share with you some of the points of our history of trying to be a green swan. Natura as is a 51, as you said, is a Brazilian cosmetics company, now became a multinational. I will talk a little bit later, but was born as a Brazilian company that came from dreams. In the origin, there was just dreams, not capital, not technology, not bright solutions. The solutions came from the heart. My dear partner, Luis Seabra, the very first founder, had a dream at that time that cosmetics could be an important tool to promote well-being, to promote the better relationship of one with his own body, with himself, with the others, with society, with the nature that we are part of, with the whole. We are talking about the systemic view. And this was the dream. Just with a lipstick, just with a fragrancy to promote this connection. We think that life is a chain of relationships, and take care of these relationships is to produce a better place to live, to promote better lives. This dream, it was about also to fight the manipulation of fears, anxieties, mostly of women in relation to their bodies. That was the pattern, that was the standard on the beauty industry. And we were born with the perception that somehow we could do differently and to promote well-being for a larger number of people. It was also part of the very beginning, the perception of the key role of relationships in the life of individuals and organizations. And our name, Natura, says a lot about our intuitive and deep connection to nature. The first decade, it was a continuous effort striving to survive. From a very small shop where Luis Seabra give consultations to the adoption of the direct selling business model that would permit multiply the number of consultations and give economic stability for the business. It was a decade of overcome the day-by-day challenges that were ahead of this very new business. The second decade, when I entered I founded two of the companies that were part of of what it is today, the Natura Group, was a period of important growth. And I personally became really, really impressed in this first decade that I was involved with the business, with the power of our representatives, entrepreneurship. I became very familiar with the possibilities that each of us have of promote change. That group of consultants created built the brand. It was very little known in Brazil at that time, and we saw the brand spread all over our large territory, based not much in technology, but based on shared values, shared passions. And this impressed me very much, and reinforced in me this possibility there is inside of each of us. When we were 20 years ago and 20 years old, and this was the beginning of the 90s, we got to merge the 5 small companies that we were at that time. And we went through a deep reflection. Otto could relate this to the U theory, on the company's purpose and what we want to be in the future. We were not anymore children. We are becoming adults when we were 20. And we decided to go deep in the process of defining our deepest beliefs, our purpose, what we would like to be in the future. And this brought to our consciousness that Natura, it was a company, and it is a company guided by the relationships, and our ultimate purpose is to promote what we call well-being well. The relationship, as I said, with yourself, with others, society, nature, and the whole. We realize that life is a chain of relationships. Nothing in the universe stands alone. Everything is interdependent. And I will close my presentation talking about the perception of pandemic, as pandemic has showed us, for the good and bad, how we are connected, how we can't avoid to recognize that we are all connected. And in 92, in this exercise of purpose, we brought to our consciousness about this perception that everything is interdependent. And the company, we said at that moment, is not just a mean to generate wealth, but a broader agent of transformation, a change agent, a part of influence, and is influenced by the whole. And we said at that time, the value of the business and its longevity, is totally connected with its purpose, with its capacity to deliver contributions towards the evolution of society and its sustainable development. We also realize that life is an eternal process of complexification, which requires us to seek constant improvement. We are not never getting there. We are always in a process of improvement. And it was with this attitude that we started our journey in the field of sustainability, learning by doing and improving step by step. At that time, little was said about sustainable development. Still less about sustainable business. We traced the past with more doubts than certainties. And my dear John Elkington brought the triple bottom line concept in 1994 and helped us a lot to understand a little better what we were trying to do. In 98, thinking about the everything is connected, nothing is, no change is promoted alone. We are part of the change, but the real change will be born if we connect people, connect different actors, and through this process of reflection, we try in the end of the eights, we reinforce the belief that we need to promote cultural change, and we helped to establish the Instituto Ethos, that was an institution to spread this culture of sustainability among Brazilian business. At about the same time, reflecting on what we could do for the protection and the environment at the end of the 90s, we decided to value and invest in Brazilian biodiversity, mainly from the Amazonian region. That was when we started our relationship with the Amazon forest and the communities that live there. This process culminated with we decided at that time we had not a roadmap, but we decided that we were going to invest for a decade at least to get to know how to relate to the local communities, the indigenous peoples, the river people, the people that lives on the rivers, to build this capacity to help to preserve, at the same time producing high quality products to deliver to our clients. This process culminated in the launch of Echo's line, the construction of a factory, and now we are connected to 5.1 thousand families and the preservation of 1.8 million hectares of forests. But as a learning process, in 2012, we were asking people like you, what's new in this vision of the contribution of business to promote change? It was the Rio Plus 20 year, around 2012, and we heard about the B Lab, the chart and B Lab, the assess, and we just made ask a question: are we able, Natura at the time, to be certified? We were already a public company. We went through an IPO in 2004, and there was a doubt if with our size, our diversity, and with our shareholders, not anymore, just a few of us, which would be the reaction when we say to them that we are committed not only to them, shareholders, but the stakeholders as a whole, the planet, the people in general. But we decide to go through the process, the certification, and this opens a fantastic reflection. The assessment process with more than 150 indicators led to reflect deeply and systematically on the aspects of sustainability that we shared so much. The result, much more than certification, was the development of an important roadmap to go ahead in our search of improvement, of search of being better. We were also aware that to promote systemic change, it was not enough to be a good guy certified, and we would like to help the movement to spread. And being a public company, it would be somehow a way to say, it's possible, my dears. There is no fault, there is no excuse to avoid to do the right thing. And so we went into this community, and at the same time, the big team, a group of leaders, well-known leaders committed to the same purpose, the Global Compact, and so on. We were almost 45 years old, 5 years ago, when we decided that we were going to expand internationally. We were somehow in a comfortable situation in Latin America, but our willingness to promote change, it was not circumscripted to the Latin America continent, for sure. And so we decided that we could bring together other brands with a beautiful heritage to compound a group that could expand this culture to the different geographies. So in 2015, we bought the Australian company ASOP, and later in 2017, we incorporate the very famous brand, The Body Shop, founded by Anita Roddick, one of the most brilliant activists of our times. In the last, this year, the beginning of this year, we bring Avon to the table, and now we are in more than 100 countries, 3,000 stores, reaching 400 million consumers. And this is a fantastic possibility to promote change. We are not saying that we another time alone we are not going to do much, but we trust that we have an important tool to do a lot of things. In the midst of this pandemic, we launched our commitment to that we call Commitment to Life. That is our commitments to this next decade. And among our commitments, it is to fight climate crisis, for sure, and protect the Amazon, to defend human rights and to be humankind, to promote gender equality, living wages, and things like that, to embrace circularity, to be full circularity of, to have full circularity of packaging by 2030, and to enter invests deeply in regenerative solutions, as John Elkington said. So there is a lot of the science-based targets defined to reach. And so we are reinforcing our commitments to the next decade, the sixth decade that we are going through. Final remarks. To end this brief reflections, I would like to stress that pandemic has shown that has reinforced that perception that everything is interdependent, for better and worse, and that we must work together to find the disruptive solutions that will lead us to a better future. That's what Natura & Co. and I believe. That's what we have hope for. And that's what we will continue to work for, with a lot of love and passion. That is what moves us. Thank you, John.
Guilherme, thank you immensely for that. And I think just watching the chat conversations going through, I think people feel the same love and thanks towards you. And we'll conclude in a little while with Otto Sharma, who I think will be resonating to many of the things that you talked about, but in a sense, leading from the emerging future. But I mean, your story is an extraordinary one, and how wonderful that it continues. But before we go to Otto, we have Rick Alexander, who is founder of the Shareholder Commons. And Rick, you're regarded as one of the 10 most highly regarded corporate governance lawyers in the world, and you've done a number of books on all of this. But tell us, if you would, about how the Shareholder Commons is aiming to move markets.
Thanks, John. I feel honored to be in this group, and it's very exciting. But listening, I have to say, I'm listening to what went before, and especially some of the things Shar said, and reading through the chat. I want to modify, I think, what I'm just going to talk about a little bit, just to, I think, emphasize. We talk about green swans, and I think it's important to emphasize that no green swans are going to save us. I know that there's a lot of good feeling on this panel and in this Humanity Rising conference, but there's no question that we're in a lot of trouble. And I think it's going to take every one of us pulling together, lots of hard work by people. And so even some of the more cynical comments I'm seeing in the chat, to me, I want to respond to those people and say, you're right. Businesses are not going to be able to fix this for us. Big business isn't going to fix it for us. It's really the job of all of us. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Shareholder Commons, a new NGO we put together, and how you can participate in what they're doing. But I just want to start with, because Shar inspired me with the ducks and the poetry and Jackson Pollock. I thought of a haiku that might sort of fit, but this theme, which would be: swans fly overhead, above furious quiet, all the ducks paddling. So keep that in mind as we kind of walk through these slides, and hopefully I'm going to be successful sharing them. Everybody see my slides? Okay. There we are.
Yes,
So,
we can see those.
Rick, you're good.
Terrific. So the shareholder comment, Shar talked about B-Lab and their work creating a platform so that companies could be responsible. And after I spent 26 years being a corporate governance lawyer, as John described, most of that time, obviously US based, most of that time I spent telling directors and companies, that their duty was to work on behalf of shareholders, and that most of their shareholders wanted them to make a lot of money. And so that was sort of what they ought to do, and that's what they ought to focus on. Obviously more complicated than that, but That's what it felt like it boiled down to sometimes. And that's when I kind of glommed onto the B Corp movement through a long series of events, got very involved and helped them to draft the statutes that they were trying to put in place around the United States to allow companies to be more responsible, as you've already heard in some of today's earlier presentations. And I went to work for B Lab, and I worked there for 4 years, helping them spread the word about this new form of corporation, whether it was helping to write statutes, and there's now statutes in 38 states in the US, in British Columbia, in Canada, in several companies now in South America and in Italy. As Shar said, there's a movement to, while they're not benefit corporations, essentially require all companies in the UK to have a pro-stakeholder stance. And there's a recent report from EY, commissioned by the EC, which, although it doesn't have recommendations, it basically says the best option for fixing corporate governance in Europe would be a directive to all member states that their directors of companies have obligations to consider the interests of shareholders, not just the ability to do it, but the obligation to do it. So there's I think, a strong movement in that direction. And there's also a lot of companies just doing it. Guillermo talked about their acquisition of Avon. That took a 2/3 vote of a US-based company to approve that merger, where those shareholders got shares in a company that essentially has that kind of governance. So shareholders are willing to accept this. But I think that the disconnect I found working at B Lab was that while we had created this form and all sorts of tools for companies to be responsible, there isn't the same sort of structure for shareholders. And, the global equity markets that own companies that make about $4 trillion in profits every year, publicly listed companies, are owned by my thing. So capitals, at the end of the day, much of that money is in foundations, in endowments, in pension funds, in retirement savings. A lot of those shares are held by ordinary human beings. And the question is, how can you sort of put that capital to use? For example, are you in a pension fund? Do you own a mutual fund? Have you talked to your mutual fund about how you want them to vote their shares? And so the idea of the shareholder commons is to use the power of shareholders to create an environment in which it's easier for companies to be B Corps. And I want to talk about this one initiative that we're focused on called the Guardrail Project. But I would say that, and this might be slightly contrary to the both and, because sometimes you have to choose, you do have to make a choice. And a lot of the ESG movement, the movement of shareholders to push companies to be more responsible from an environmental perspective, a lot of that has focused on the idea of doing well by doing good, that if you treat your employees better, they'll be better employees, and so you'll be a better company and you'll make more money. Or if you treat the environment better, you'll get a better reputation, and that will allow you to garner more customers, and people will want to come work for you, and you'll make more money. And that's great. I'm all for doing well by doing good. But sometimes companies have to choose between profits and doing good. In other words, although you can do well by doing good, you can also do well by doing pretty bad. And we need to take those options off the table. And the idea of the Guardrail Project is to create guardrails that will protect the commons that we all need, whether it's environmental commons or social commons or economic commons. We need to take business strategies off the table that promote inequality and dangerous environmental conditions. The other piece, an important strand of this strategy, is we think that universal owners, these pension funds, mutual funds who are diversified across the spectrum, have the incentive to actually make this happen. Because if you say you're an index fund, a BlackRock managed index fund, and you own the S&P 500. Well, if one company in your portfolio has figured out how to make a lot of money by, promoting anti-vax propaganda, that's terrible for the other 499 companies in your portfolio, because anti-vax propaganda means it's less likely we'll be able to get ahead of the pandemic sooner, which means it's less likely that we'll have economic growth and be able to bring people back. And that's a problem. And so the idea is that if you're an owner of the entire market, you actually don't benefit from sort of antisocial business behavior. And so the idea is to make these guardrails through shareholder activism tickets to the game for companies. Let me go to the next slide. So an important point of this theory is that companies are not in a position to really do all the hard work necessary to get them to a spot where they are truly innovative without some outside help. So if you think about, Milton Friedman has been vilified, over the last decade for sort of bringing us to this point where profits seem more important than people. But I think, if you read deeply in sort of what he said, his point was a little bit more along the lines of, when markets work, companies pursuing profits leads to efficiency and innovation. And he was enough of an economist to understand that markets don't always work. And that's the real problem we have. So if you say to CEOs and managers, make as much money as you can, and you reward them for that with stock options and other things, that's where their motivation is going to go. And then if you say to them, but we also want you to be stakeholder oriented, think about the recent Business Roundtable statement, we want you to be stakeholder oriented, that puts them in a place where they're almost comparing incommensurable things, because how do you measure, your profit versus, social good, environmental good, when you don't know what your competitors are doing? It works much better if you can sort of set a limit and say, this is the permissible carbon footprint, or this is the sort of range of permissible wage options that we think are okay in a civil society. And that takes some of the conflict off the managers. They can just sort of manage to profit within these guardrails. And so that's kind of the idea of taking some of these fundamental decisions out of the hands of the board. And as I said earlier, these universal owner, these big pension funds, mutual funds, are best positioned to get that done for one reason, as I mentioned earlier, because they actually suffer from the their portfolios suffer when one company externalizes costs onto other companies. But in addition, they're beneficiaries, the human beings behind the mutual funds, behind the pension funds, behind the endowments. Those human beings suffer when the earth suffers, when our environmental system suffers, and when inequality becomes intolerable and grows. So they're in a really good position to sort of think more holistically about the environmental, social, and economic systems that companies and human beings are embedded in. And they have the ability through corporate governance rights to actually do something about it. And so the idea, the big idea behind the Guardrail Project is that then if the human beneficiaries behind pension funds and mutual funds are only going to do well if the first job of these institutional shareholders who represent them is to preserve environmental systems and social systems and economic systems. And the question people always, I think the obvious question is, well, isn't what you just described the job of government? Shouldn't we have government regulate industry, regulate, environment, regulate wage laws, and then let companies compete within that. And the problem is, as we all know this, yes, government should do that, but government is imperfect. One thing is that, there's 170 governments or so around the world, and companies can arbitrage between jurisdictions and try to, get work done in jurisdictions that don't have strong environmental and worker protections. The other problem is just technology moves at a very fast pace, and government by nature is slow. Another problem is that where managers are charged with making as much profit as they can, one thing they can do is invest in corrupting government. And, in the United States, since a Supreme Court decision a few years back made it harder for government to regulate spending by corporations, we've seen a huge rise in that spending. And, that has an effect. People are spending that money for a reason. And so we think that there's an important place for shareholders themselves to do some of this work. And so that's what we're doing. And I would invite everybody on this, listening to this program, to think about how they can contribute. It's possible that you work somewhere within the financial industry, and that gives you the ability to try to work within your organization on these issues. It's possible that you're within the management of a company that has a 401k plan, and you have the ability to put funds into the pool of funds available to your employees that are more responsible from this perspective, because there's a lot of funds that do care about this. And to the extent that you own an index fund in BlackRock in your 401k account, you have the ability. There was a report released today by Majority Action about how BlackRock voted with respect to climate and other matters. You can look at that and see if you're okay with that, and you can write them, and you can tell them that you're going to move your money if they don't change it. And if they hear from enough people, that can make change. And just more generally, I think it's important for people to be aware that there is a way to look at industry and business in this holistic sort of systems manner and recognize that you can have capitalism and capital markets that work in a way that doesn't insist that each company maximize its own value, and yet uses markets in a very environmentally and socially friendly way. And so I think that is the end of my presentation, and thank everybody for their time.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you for developing the Guardrail project. I don't think anyone here would argue that government is unimportant. I think it's absolutely essential, but it needs to be done better. And you've touched on that to some degree. Now, Otto Sharma is known to everyone listening, I am sure, based at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, renowned for concepts like Theory U, and as I referenced in terms of Guilherme's story, very much focusing on what it means to lean into the emergent future and lead in that emergent future. So Otto, some reflections from you would be extremely welcome.
Thank you, John. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. It is such a privilege and joy to listen to the fantastic contributions that we have heard so far. And rather than presenting our story and the Presenting Institute story as a Green Swan, I thought I just maybe add to the conversation a few lenses kind of that helps us to maybe decipher more of some of the stories that we heard, and then move into the conversation from there. So what might be helpful is so let me just bring that up here. What might be helpful is to zoom out just a little bit and to look at, and that's really what I so much love about not only kind of the most recent book, John, but also really all your work, really to link the social responsibility and sustainability concepts with systems thinking, with the hard questions that we need to ask ourselves. So I would like to add a little bit to that conversation and also talk about what you just mentioned, kind of how do we connect to the emerging future? Because what we heard, John, you were talking about like the old order that is coming apart. So we live, as we all know, in a moment of disruption where we are here in current reality. And what does disruption mean? It means the future is going to be different from the past because it's not sustainable. So we know a lot about this current reality. We know less about here, the emerging future. But what we know least about is the journey from here to there, kind of. So what it takes to connect with and then actualize emerging future possibilities. And the perspective that we are taking kind of from a theory or from an awareness-based systems change methodology is that what it takes is a journey that is an outer journey and an inner journey. An outer journey that takes you to the edges of the system, but also an inner journey that takes you to the deeper sources of knowing that several of you, but in particular Guilherme, were talking about. So if we double click on that term, what is a state-of-the-art concept of systems thinking? Because at the core of the conversation we are having here is the question of the system and how we can transform it. Now, you all have seen many times this kind of systems thinking concept here that starts with, and all systems thinking concepts do, a simple distinction with symptoms at the top and root issues below the waterline. And in this case, you see 3 different types of root issues that in a nutshell give you the story of the evolution of systems thinking over the past half century plus, which is kind of from structures, right, that we need to pay attention to thought, paradigms of thought that are underlying, of course, and that need to be reframed, to the deepest dimension here that came into sight more explicitly, I would say, over the past decade or two. And I call it source here, but I think in Guilherme's story, we had a wonderful account kind of these deeper. So when he talked about the deeper sources of where the company was envisioned from, right? The dreams, when he talked about purpose. So sources of what? It's sources of energy, sources kind of our attention and intention, and also sources of our self and identity. So basically, awareness-based systems change, in my view, can be summarized with these following 4 sentences. You cannot understand a system unless you change it. Famously, Kurt Lewin, of course, the founder of Action Research. 2, you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. So that's to say, you cannot change a system unless you include all 4 of these levels. The first 2 or 3 is not enough. Now, if that's true, then of course, the real question is how? How do we do that? And this is kind of my learning to that point. You cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. Now, all traditional systems thinkings based intervention in social systems would have claimed you cannot transform a system unless you make a system see itself. But in my experience, that's not enough, because then it's still stuck in the head. You need to add the sensing dimension. because only that will unlock the intelligence of the heart, right? And the intelligence of the collective. So, and lastly, as I learned kind of from Ubirasi Patasho, an indigenous leader from Brazil the other day, so when we had a joint session, echoing Gandhi and many others, to do all this, we need to be the system. So if we now, look at the last two here, we need to be the system. We need to embody the future that we want to see, as Gandhi put it. You cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. What does that really mean in terms of transformation? So when you look at that shift of awareness and shift of consciousness, it basically means this, that we move from one level way of looking at the system that's based on this separation here, which is I am in here and reality is out there, right? Subject object consciousness. So that we move from that way of looking at things to a perspective that is looking at systems from this perspective, where I not only see the stuff around me, but I notice how I am contributing to the problem that we face. So a systems thinking shift from this way, the system is something out there, has nothing to do with me, to seeing myself being part of the system. That's the heart of all real change in organizations and in communities and in larger systems today. And when this shift of awareness from looking at the world as something out there to bending the beam of observation back onto the observing self. So when that happens on the level of the individual, what do we call it? We call it reflection or mindfulness. Mindfulness is paying attention to our attention. It starts there. But when that happens on the level of the team, let's say a leadership team, and on the level of conversation, it's that shift from here to there is a shift from debate to dialogue. Dialogue is not people talking with each other. Dialogue is making a system see itself, or maybe in some cases even sense and see itself. So the first time I saw that, actually, this shift and this paying attention to this deeper dimension of change that Guilherme was referencing in his story was in actually listening to practitioners, in kind of listening to innovators. And here is what one of them, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, after having, led kind of many episodes of transformation as a CEO, how he summarized his own experience. The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So the success of what I do as a change maker depends on the inner place from that I'm operating. What is that inner place? Today, I would say this inner place has everything to do with this. Stop downloading, stop projecting habitual patterns of thought, and begin to activate these three instruments of knowing. The open mind, the open heart, and the open will, AKA curiosity, compassion, and courage. Now, that's of course what we practice, like in a U leadership context. But let's be real. What is it that's actually going on? The precise opposite, right? Even though there's a lot of evidence for this storyline here, the story of, so where do our, so that we heard panelists from the country of Bolsonaro, Johnson, and Trump, right? So what is the reality we are speaking from? It's a reality where this story has been amplified to a level we haven't seen before. So it's not opening the mind, opening the heart, opening the will. It's a freeze reaction, right? Closing the mind, closing the heart, closing the will, AKA amplification of ignorance hate, and fear. So that means rather than moving into a process of suspending our judgment and real seeing, it is projecting and blinding ourselves, right? So that's kind of the US COVID response. That's the US response to climate change. Rather than empathizing and sensing, we are moving into entrenching. We are digging into our own filter bubbles and so forth and desensing and so on. Rather than letting go, connecting with the emerging future possibility, we are holding on to the past, making America great again, right? And disconnecting with emerging future possibilities. Rather than bringing the new into reality, we are on a collective level, we are engaging in patterns of manipulation, abuse, destruction, and eventually self-destruction. So that's what we see today. And when we double click, so a phenomenon, what I believe is that just talking about this part of the reality is, so this is where the attention and intention needs to be realigned, but we cannot be blind to this part of reality. So that's something we need to address and transform. So speaking about that transformation and addressing, so what we see there is three types of violence that two of which are very familiar to you: direct violence, structural violence, to a massive degree, right, with the economic structures. But then underneath, the third concept that I believe is really critical to develop of violence, which is attentional violence, by which I mean not seeing others in terms of who they really are and could be. So addressing and transforming these patterns of violence, right, in the upper cycle of absencing, in my view, has to do with three main blind spots. The blind spot of not seeing what's going on, that's the issue of the frozen mind. And the issue of ignorance and bias that in the Black Lives Matter moment, we all have become much more aware of. But then there's a second dimension. The desensing, it's not feeling. I see something, but I'm not feeling it. And that's a barrier we all felt probably breaking down in the 8 minutes, 46 seconds video, the killing of George Floyd, where the frozen heart just broke open for so many of us. And we moved from a process of othering to a more directly felt connection. But the third blind spot, of course, is seeing what's going on, feeling the empathy, and still not acting on the level of the collective, which of course describes in many ways what we are doing today on the level of the collective. So the issue of the frozen will, which comes with depression and destruction. So what I would add to the conversation is that yes, what it takes to address these issues is, of course, to on one level cultivate the open mind, open heart, open will individually, but we also need a collective response that creates society-wide new infrastructures on the level of learning, on the level of democracy, and on the level of the economy. New learning infrastructures around whole person, whole systems learning, new democratic infrastructures making democracy more direct, distributed, and dialogic. And I think we see the power of that in most countries today, where the majority of the population is pro-sustainability action, but the governments that are like and the political process that is hijacked by the 1%ers is not. And the new economy infrastructures that help us to transform the economy from ego to eco. So let me close with just kind of two little kind of indications here on those two levels. the reframing of the economy, right, really, in my view, has to do, from ego to eco, has to do with going beyond the commodity, what Carl Polanyi called the commodity fiction of our production factors. Initially, nature, labor, capital, but today we have, a bunch of more production factors. And the essence here really is to move from a commodity fiction-based way of framing our economy around ecosystem awareness to one that's framed around ecosystem awareness, around all these key dimensions, including the dimension of governance, and kind of where the last contribution from Frederick was referring to, which I think is a core dimension, kind of moving from markets and hierarchies and traditional property rights to awareness-based collective actions and commons-based property rights. But to do all of that will remain theory if we do not develop deeper collective learning capacities as a society. So what's going on in learning and leadership today? Two things: the deepening of the learning process and the broadening of the learning process from the individual to the ecosystem, right? And the deepening is basically from head-centric to transformational. Where do all the resources go today? Here, right? It's kind of focusing on the individual, and it's mostly head-centric structures of learning. And where's the blind spot today? What do we need in order to address the big challenges of our time? It's up here. It's transformational learning and leadership infrastructures that on all levels, particularly on the level of the whole ecosystem. And that's, I believe, an additional dimension to really make the shift, John, that you're writing about with the Green Swans really possible. So I talked a little bit about the enabling infrastructure for us on the level of the collective to move from here to there. And what I basically said is, yes, we need this, the new economic infrastructures, but there's two more things that we need, without which none of this will ever work. And that is the new democratic infrastructures and the new learning infrastructures. And my own focus is a little bit kind of on this part of the equation, where I try to make a contribution, which basically is helping the planet, this planetary healing and the civilizational renewal by helping by capacitating change makers to activate generative social fields, right? To turn stakeholder systems from toxic to co-creative. And to do that, to engage in this deeper leadership work, we need a support infrastructure, which I call kind of a school for transformation, right? For the decade ahead, which is the decade of transformation, that is focusing on this, democratizing access to transformation literacy by integrating science, consciousness, social technologies, kind of the methods and tools of awareness-based systems change, and profound societal renewal. So we live in an age of transformation. We are in the beginning of a decade of transformation, but the access to the transformation literacy that is required today is very unevenly distributed and is hardly existing at all. That in itself, I think, is one of the enabling conditions we need to put into place, and a piece that I wanted to add to the conversation.
Otto, thank you immensely. That was beautiful and it was profound. And I think you've persuaded me that I need to go back to school, the School of Transformation. I think we probably all need to go back to the School of Transformation. Now, thank you. And I think all of these different presentations are built one upon the other. There have been a huge number of comments in the chat channel. Only a couple of questions. And in a way, I don't want to blow apart Jim Garrison's and Humanity Rising's 100th day by completely removing the time constraints and guardrails on this conversation. So what I'm inclined to do now is to hand back to John Montgomery, just to give a few reflections, and then have you, John, hand back to Jim. But I just wanted to reflect very briefly on each of the speakers that we've heard, whether it's Shah talking about the B-Lab movement, Guilherme talking about the way in which one company evolved and embraced the B Corporation agenda, and Rick talking about the Guardrail Project and how we've got to move well beyond what individual companies do or individual governments even. And Otto talking about the need for transformation and the need for having a deep understanding of what that means for ourselves and for our organizations and for the wider world. I think there's a very coherent story coming through here. And I think we could very easily have taken any one of those presentations and opened out the conversation for a couple of hours. So I do encourage people to go back to the information and questions and commentary that was in the chat. But John Montgomery, if I could hand back to you and just say thank you hugely for inviting us all. Over to you, please.
Well, thank you very, very much, John. I am feeling such joy and happiness in this moment. I was inspired by your book, John, to convene this gathering, and I'm really speechless. All of you were terrific. I couldn't be happier. And my apologies to you, John, at the beginning for not having done justice to your background and biography and giving you a proper introduction. My intention was to give all of the time I could to the five of you so that our audience could hear your amazing stories. And I can't thank you all enough for your stories and your participation and the wisdom that you brought to the audience today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, who can perhaps direct some questions or decide how he wants to conform to the norms of Humanity Rising.
Thank you. And I echo what you just said, John. This has been a splendid panel. And I think if I had one question that I think is really important for all of us to grapple with, it comes out of what you just said, Otto, about the need to make energetic progress in the good. You know, we want to be more curious, compassionate, and courageous, but our world is dominated by fear, hate, and ignorance. And I'd love you to comment on this, because I think this is probably the most poignant reality in our world. I mean, if you look at the United States, God, you talk about fear, hate, and ignorance. It is ruling from the Oval Office of the White House. And it looks highly probable that we're going to see an election distorted as it was in 2016, and a psychopath given a renewed mandate. You go to Brazil, you have a similar pattern of essentially a psychopath. And you can go around the world in India and China and UK, the Gulf Emirates, and there is an upsurge of civilization There's an upsurge in consciousness, you know, all the work that you're doing, all the work that all of us are doing. I mean, look at Natura, Guilherme, that's just a stupendous story. And you've got Bolsonaro and the burning of the Amazon. So Otto, comment, any of you others, we don't have a lot of time, but this is such an important moment because you hit the nail on the head. This is where we're all at. And we want to focus on the good, but we're being kind of inundated by the shadow content. And how do you square that? What would you tell us what needs to be done? How do we hold this contradiction?
Well, that's such a great question, Jim. I think there is no single answer to that. I think that's really the invitation to have a conversation around that. That will take longer than the time we have left here. But just to kick that off, maybe 2-3 points. One is looking at your definition of Green Swan, John. What I like about it is kind of the systemic part built into that. So it's really a misunderstanding to use that term and say, well, we are a Green Swan and you are not, or something like that, because it's a systemic shift that you describe, really, right? And what I try to spell out with this presencing, absencing, which is, the opening of the mind-heart well, courage, curiosity, and compassion, or the freeze reaction, kind of where we have ignorance, hate, and fear. So that's, you could say, so that could be one lens to look at the Black Swan, Green Swan dynamic, right, that you discussed. Because the deeper systemic shift, in my view, if you look at it from a consciousness-based systems view or awareness-based systems view, has to do with developing these interior conditions on the level of the collective, right? So that has to do with these infrastructures, but also with these leadership capacities of opening up in the face of disruption. In my view, the phenomenon of Trumpism, which is universal and global, right? So we see it in all countries, is, you can explain that with two factors, right? Which is, one, massive disruption is happening in our time. And two, a lack of capacity of opening the mind, opening the heart, opening the will, a lack of curiosity, compassion, courage. So which means it's a massive educational failure, right? So if you hit disruption and you have not had the possibility to really develop these capacities, then life is throwing you into this absencing space, which is self-protection, right? The freeze reaction, freezing the mind, heart, will, is self-protection. It's a trauma response. Yep. And so that's, I think, where the leverage is. And I would say, why is it so much amplified the last 4 or 5 years? Well, from an American perspective, there's two very clear answers. It's dark money and social media, right? So social media, for those who have not seen it, the Social Dilemma on Netflix, it just came out. It's the update of the story. The most important book last year, I think, was The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. So that's the update when you go to the Social Dilemma Netflix documentary. Yeah, that's the so we created we allowed the commodification to happen one more time, right? Which Polanyi describes for the 19th century. England. So it happened one more time. It's a land grab by tech companies that we need to reverse. And that's why democracy is at the core of this battle. If you go to one of the most inspiring stories that I have seen lately is the Save the Bees story in Bavaria, the most conservative state in Germany, where the majority of the population went to a referendum and voted for, basically a sustainability-based shift in agriculture. So the problem is not that we have too much democracy. The problem is we do not have real choices about the collective goods that we are consuming. And that starts with agriculture, it continues with health and so on. The majority of the population wants one thing, but the decision makers, through the influence of dark money, are deciding something else. And that's where the leverage point is. So it is kind of advancing the economic transformation, but also advancing the democratic transformation together with building these deeper capacities. So that's at least the way I see it. And it's also, it tells us, Jim, that the phenomenon that we have this, the Trumpism all over the world, it's a wake-up moment for us, because what we see there is the mirror of the collective. So COVID, as we all know, was not an equalizer. It was an amplifier and a mirror, right? Where we see what's broken. We see the results of our collective actions, enacted there. So that's where this current moment is so important for a new beginning, the way John was describing, and where it really matters kind of how we respond to that situation. John, what do you think?
In the simplest of terms, Otto, I agree. That was beautifully and horrifically stated. I mean, absolutely exact capture of where I think we are. I think a bit like Guilherme, I'm into my early 70s now, and I feel that the next 10 to 15 years are not a time, for me at least, for retirement, that they're going to be the most exciting, the most challenging, and in some ways the most dangerous years of my working career. But this set of conversations, presentations has really given me, again, huge confidence that we can do this. I'm not guaranteeing that we will do this, but we'll be much better able to do it if we do it in concert. I think movements like the B Corporation movement are incredibly inspiring. I think the shareholder commons approach the same. There are not enough companies like Natura yet doing what they're doing. But in the end, this is political. It's got to come back to our cultures, in a sense, almost our civilization. And I would love, however I do it, to get, I've read your books, Otto, but I would love to sort of be immersed in some of your thinking and some of the people that you're interacting with. So that's something for a separate conversation. But I'm excited, genuinely. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons to be pessimistic, but I think this is a time to be optimistic and, as they say, to change the world.
Any other quick responses from any of the panelists before we close?
Jim, just to reinforce that, to face the tough moments that we live, as Otto mentioned and John, with the kind of political leadership, the only way that we see is to bring together the different actors, to reinforce democracy, to reinforce conversation in this personal and collective reflection about the needs that we face. I have been involved in many other movements, including one to protect Amazon, to face the government policies and things like that. And it's unusual the way that the companies, civil society, environmentalists went to the same table to discuss, is this in this direction that we want to go? And this brings hope another time to energize our walk through a new future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe if I may, I'll just quickly add to it, knowing that the sun is going down here in London. So I think I'm a little bit fuzzier than I was when we started due to the lighting. But I just wanted to sort of agree. And I think as we think about these collectives and these systems coming together, I just hope that we make sure these are intergenerational conversations and that we actively bring young people into the discussions, into the conversations, into the collectives, and into the partnerships and coalitions of the willing and the movements of movements. And I just hope that, you know, as we go into this space and we need to stretch what is possible, we also make sure we are constantly being inspired and moved and feeling, sensing from the incredible gifts that the arts community and the culture community has to give us. So I'm holding so deeply this openness of mind and heart and will and hands. And I know I'm going to definitely be bringing this sort of framing into the work I do with sort of young people. So thank you very much. And yeah, intergenerational and arts and culture as a fuel for where we can go next.
Well, thank you. You know, Ubiquity is a B Corp. And so we're with you 100%, Char. It's the future. It's totally the future, boy. Frederick, do you want to have a quick final word?
I don't know that I can top any of that. I'm intensely curious now about the connection between Otto's work and Pollinator, who was sort of an inspiration for our work, because you know his view was that companies and people are embedded in these systems and that we've got to focus on the systems. And I've always taken that to be like a critical insight. And I mean, he saw it so early. He saw, you know, the sort of wrong turn. I mean, a lot of us talk about this history as though, you know, Milton Friedman and, you know, some takeover artists in the 1970s and 80s invented the problem with shareholder primacy, but it really cuts through, you know, everything after the Enlightenment, and it's kind of incredible to hear everybody talking about really coming full circle and you know, finding the next phase.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been magnifique. And John Montgomery, you're the prime mover here. This is your second home run on Humanity Rising. And Otto and anyone else, I would love to be in discussion with you about another session specifically on the point that I was raising of this interface between the light and shadow content, given the kind of very extraordinary condition set of our time, because I think that interface and how those of us that are working tirelessly to create more light need to understand both the psychohistorical, spiritual dynamic of the interface of darkness and light, and how we can ensure within the framework of what the scientists are telling us that we're running out of time, that we all end up where we all know we want humanity to be. So if you're up to it, maybe, you know, a whole session just going over, you know, one or two of those slides, because I think you're pointing to something that everybody in the world is being galvanized into thinking about as we all find ourselves enveloped in lockdown and social distancing in a pandemic we never saw coming. And now is lasting for a much longer time than we imagined at the beginning. So I'd like to be in touch with you. And I just want to thank everybody once again for a magnificent testimonial to the rising of Green Swans. Then tomorrow, we're going to have a dialogue with a British philosopher, Tim Freck, who has been reflecting philosophically on the magnitude and import of the pandemic and a way for humanity to see the future with new lens. So that'll be tomorrow. Again, same time, same station, 5 o'clock to 6:30 p.m. Central European Time, as Humanity Rising continues with its commitment to allow these kinds of discussions every day, Monday through Friday, for as long as the pandemic lasts. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow, and we'll be in touch on various matters. And there's a chat group if you want to continue to discuss this. There's a link in the chat. And just as a reminder, Humanity Rising Netherlands has now been launched as of yesterday. So it's in its second day and starting just about now. If you speak Dutch and want to be dealing with Humanity Rising issues as it pertains to Holland. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thank you very much.
Great session. Great session.
Bye-bye.